You're listening to the Quint's podcast.
US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken met with External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, NSA Ajit Doval, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi in his maiden visit to India from 27 to 28 July. This is the second visit of a high ranking US official to India since the Biden administration took over in January this year. On the agenda of this diplomatic visit were ongoing tensions on Afghanistan, India's role in the Indo-Pacific, and the COVID-19 pandemic. However, his visit began not with his Indian counterparts, but with representatives from various states in India and a constitutional lawyer, where India's contention issues ranging from religious freedom laws, farmer protests, press freedom, minority rights, and the recent Pegasus snoop were discussed. This is not the first time that the US has raised the issue of democracy with India, the last being in the form of a public letter written by the chairman of US Senate Foreign Relations Committee Bob Menendez on the eve of US Secretary of Defense Lloyd J Austin's visit to India in March. At a joint presser on 28 July, Blinken stressed the importance of the relation between the two countries, stating that there are few relationships in the world that are more vital than the one between US and India. In this episode, we will discuss the main takeaways from the visit and where the US-India relation is headed. To discuss all this, we spoke with Manoj Joshi, a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. You're tuned in to The Big Story, the podcast where we dissect the headline making news for you, and I'm your host, Himmat. Secretary Blinken was in India for less than 24 hours, having landed in India on 27 July night and left on a plane to Kuwait the next day. However, in this short time, he may have ruffled the feathers of New Delhi by bringing up some contentious national issues. He started his day on 28 July by holding a roundtable meeting with civil society members. In his opening remarks at the roundtable meeting, Blinken said that, and I quote, "All people deserve to have a voice in their government and be treated with respect no matter who they are." End quote. Issues concerning religious freedom, including the contentious Citizenship Amendment Act, press freedom in the light of arrest of reporters, the recent Pegasus hack which revealed a list of journalists and rights activists who were surveilled upon, and the status on farmer protests were all discussed. Menaka Guruswamy, a constitutional lawyer, and members of foundations and NGOs representing different faiths were also seen talking to Blinken in a photograph that was posted on Twitter after the meeting. Later in the day, in an interview with CNN News 18, Blinken also spoke on the restriction on internet in India with regard to the recent clampdown on social media companies like Twitter, stating that, and I quote, "Distinction between regulating misinformation in cyberspace versus political speech is a thin line." But as we stated earlier, this is not the first time that the US Biden administration has brought up the issue of democratic rights and freedom with India. On the eve of the visit of US Secretary of Defense Lloyd J Austin in March, Bob Menendez, the chairman of the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee, wrote Austin a public letter where he pertinently stated that, and I quote, "Getting the US-India partnership right is critical to addressing 21st century challenges, and that includes urging the Indian government to uphold democratic values and human rights." Now, during the same period, US-based human rights watchdog Freedom House also changed India's status from free to partly free in its annual report on global political rights and liberties. And responding to a question on India's human rights records, Blinken, in a carefully worded statement, said that, and I quote, "We recognize that every democracy, starting with our own, is a work in progress. And when we discuss these issues, I certainly do it from a starting point of humility." Now, the MEA, anticipating that the issues of civil rights and democracy will be raised during Blinken's visit, stated ahead of his visit on 26 July that, quote unquote, "India is proud of its achievements in both domains and is always glad to share experiences, and that it is open to engaging those who now recognize the value of diversity." But given the repeated critiques by the Biden administration on the center's action towards democratic rights, should India tread carefully with the United States now? Manoj Joshi, a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, believes that the US has always been sensitive on issues relating to democracy in other countries, and it all depends on where India stands on the US interest.
I think what matters here is the place of India in US interests. If US interests demand, then I don't think they care too much about human rights, meaning, after all, they're also allied to Saudi Arabia. So that's not the issue. The question is, what place does India play in the human rights, in the American interests? Now, of course, From the systemic point of view, as a democracy, the US also has a large constituency which would like to promote democracy globally and support democracy. Lots of non governmental groups and other activist groups. So the US is always very sensitive to issues relating to democracy in other countries.
The Blinken visit was also a chance for India to clear the air with the US on the security challenges in Afghanistan, from where the US troops are slated to withdraw on 31st August. Although the move of troops withdrawal was not sudden, it may have left the country at the hands of the Taliban, who are gaining control of new areas for the past 2 months. We have covered the developments in Afghanistan in detail in our previous episodes, and a link for that will be in our show notes. In his statements on Afghanistan, Secretary Blinken said that, and I quote, if the Taliban took Afghanistan by force and abused the rights of people, they would make the country a pariah state, and no international support would be forthcoming. In the joint press conference, Minister Jaishankar stated that peace negotiations need to be taken seriously by all parties, and that, quote unquote, Afghanistan must neither be home to terrorism nor resource of refugees. Echoing his statement, Secretary Blinken stated that in the context of Afghanistan, the US and India are in alignment. While India may be looking for a detailed strategic outcome from the visit, the US in the recent past has been clear in its stance on withdrawal of troops and that nation building was never the objective in Afghanistan. As a development partner in Afghanistan for the past 20 years, India has a lot at stake in the country and is a firm advocate of peace and stability of the country. However, with the US now out of the way in Afghanistan, what options does India have to protect its interest and investments in Afghanistan? Manoj Joshi weighs in.
Well, the obvious problem for India is that of security, but that's true of all countries, meaning countries that have embassies there or countries that have interests there. So there is a common interest of various countries around the world, whether it is Iran, whether it is United States, whether it is Germany. There's a common interest in ensuring a stable and peaceful Afghanistan, and therefore there is a possible we do see some indications that all these countries are coordinating to some extent to try to ensure that the Afghan situation doesn't get out of hand, and that if there is a political transition, it's a peaceful transition, and it's not a peaceful transition which would eventually lead to bloodshed. So they want a controlled situation there because it's in their interest, in their individual interests to do so. But at the same time, since not many countries have any leverage on the situation, they keep on talking of the notion of Afghan owned, an Afghan driven peace process. So the Afghans have to do some things on their own. They can be supported by the international community.
Along with Afghanistan, China was at the forefront of issues discussed in the Blinken visit, and according to a congressional report, US India ties will continue to expand due to China. The report released by the Congressional Research Service stated that aside from India's domestic developments, including on human rights, the Biden administration's broader policies are not likely to change due to the perceived overarching need to counterbalance China. In a clear message to China during his visit, Blinken also met with an official from the Tibetan government in exile and a representative of the Dalai Lama. Now, to counter China's growing economic presence and its aggression in the Indo-Pacific, the US, Japan, India, and Australia in 2017 set up the Quadrilateral Coalition, or Quad. In an interview with a media organization, Blinken stated that it is unfortunate that Beijing is acting more repressively at home and more aggressively abroad, and that India is a strong partner for the US to effectively engage with China. However, in another interview, Blinken clarified that the Quad group is not a military alliance, but a group of like minded democracies. According to Manoj Joshi, India's record in the Quad is not very good given its lack of contributions to the group. He added that the relation India has in the Indo-Pacific, specifically in countering China, may depend on what it brings to the table.
Well, the thing is, with the Quad, Secretary Blinken very clearly said that this was not a military alliance. That's very categorical statement he has made, and he says that it's basically a coalition of democracies which has a range of interests, from enhancing COVID protection to climate change to maritime security. So lots of issues are there, but to promote this, you require, you see, if you are part of the Quad, you must contribute your own share, meaning what do you bring into the whole situation. And India's record has not been very good, in the sense India had promised to be the hub of the vaccine distribution plan, and that whole thing collapsed, meaning because India, I think, overestimated its capacity to be a major vaccine producer. So that was an issue, and so likewise, the question eventually for the other members is, what does India bring into the table? And right now, no one is sure what India brings to the table. Yes, in the larger Indo-Pacific context, India is a large country on one end of Indo-Pacific, uh, but I don't think it has much of a capacity to, uh, uh, for outreach to the Pacific part of it. It, it doesn't have the outreach capacity, meaning it doesn't have economic interests of that nature. Though Secretary, Minister Jaishankar spoke about, India's trade, etc. That we have sea lane security trade going to the region, but we often forget that a lot of that trade is to China. So I don't think we are going to protect. I don't think the Chinese are going to disrupt the trade, which is basically benefits it. You know, so in any case, this is a bit of an over statement that, that so far there has been no disruption of that trade. There is an issue with regard to the South China Sea islands, uh, but there has never really been a disruption of the trade route in any kind, because that would basically also disrupt trade to China, meaning China would be cutting its own nose to spite its face if it disrupted those trade routes.
During the visit, the shared interests of India and US cooperation against the COVID-19 pandemic were also raised by both the sides. In a joint presser, Blinken stated that, and I quote, India and US together around the world will be leaders to bring this pandemic to an end. Blinken also announced that the US will be sending additional aid of $25 million to support vaccination efforts in India. The recent aid is on top of the already $200 million provided to India by the US. However, according to Manoj Joshi, for India to be in a position where it may require aid for COVID, contrary to the claims made by the center that there are no production problems, does not present in a good light on the international stage.
I think the US understands that this was extraordinary set of circumstances, but nevertheless, the fact that the US, India has been the largest recipient of US foreign aid between 1950 and 2014. Meaning, we're the largest. We are even larger than Israel or anyone else. Okay, and a lot of that aid was given in the 1950s and 1960s. And which where the US helped us to become self-sufficient in agriculture. They helped us with food shipments. So we were in pretty bad shape. Now the point is for the US to return to an India which is requiring aid is not a particularly good sign, in the sense that it shows that India has certain weaknesses. Because we ourselves were told by our government that everything is fine, that we'll deal with the vaccines, there should be no problem. But I think they completely misread the situation. They completely misread India's vaccine production capacity, which is hugely dependent, firstly, on supplies from the US and from other countries. So as I said, that we misread our own abilities out there, and so the question for the US would be that in how many other areas is India really sure of itself? Meaning, does India really have many, have what it's needed to become, meaning constantly External Affairs Minister Jaishankar and Prime Minister say of becoming a leading power. India wants to become a leading power, not a balance. So does India have that capacity? So that is the issue.
US and India will meet again at the Quad Summit, which will be held in the next few months. To follow more updates on India US relations, stay tuned to the Quint. If you liked listening to this episode, please subscribe to The Big Story for episodic updates. We're available on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, JioSaavn, and most of the other popular podcast streaming platforms. For other podcasts, please log on to the Quint website, and for any feedback, please shoot an email to podcast@thequint.com.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.